Good evening.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Blood In, Ink Out. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about my personal history with comic books as a reader, collector, as an artist, because they have played such an important role in my life and continue to do so. One could even go so far as to say comics have changed my life, and they most certainly have in recent years as I came to discover and become part of this comic book community that has been so welcoming. And what got me to thinking about this was someone to whom comic books were incredibly important and most certainly life-changing. They set him down a path that ultimately allowed him to leave his mark on this world. He pursued his passion, and by pursued I mean worked really hard at it, and was rewarded by being able to make a life from it, and as a result influence and positively affect the lives of others. I am talking about cartoonist Ed Piskor, who, as I'm sure most of you watching are aware, tragically took his own life very recently. And I'm going to talk about Ed, but to be honest, I'm not sure exactly what to say that hasn't already been said by many others at this point. There's been a lot of content about Ed recently, including many tribute videos, people talking about what he and cartoonist kayfabe meant to them, the impact he had, or the inspiration he gave them. Now, as I said, this video will also serve as a journal entry of sorts, just on my history as a comic reader, but I also decided to speak on Ed Piskor, what impact he did have on my life. And I've decided to combine all this into one video, as I did not know Ed personally. So, how much can I really speak to the life of this man? I figure, how about I balance the scales, as it were, and use it as an opportunity to speak about myself. And when I say that, well, I'm only half joking, because all I have is my personal experience. And comic books have played a major role in this experience, this life I've lived so far. And one unexpected but perhaps most important part of this connection I've had with comic books is the people that make up the comic book community, the people I've met and interacted with, the friends I've made, the artists and writers I've had discussions with, and really anyone who shares this passion I have for this art, this medium, this ever-expanding, verdant jungle of ideas and emotions and creativity that is comics. And Ed Piskor was one of those people, one who I will always associate with my personal connection to this art form and the community that shapes it. Now, as I said, I did not know Ed personally. He would occasionally like some of my posts on Instagram, and as a King Kayfaber, I would hop into the live Patreon streams when possible. But other than that, we didn't have much interaction. I only met him once last year at Heroes Con. He didn't say much, but he was cool as a cucumber. Jim Rugg, on the other hand, was in a more talkative mood. Still, it was great to meet them both in person and get books of theirs signed. And even though we never really knew each other, Ed's work as a cartoonist and YouTuber came to play an important part of my comic journey. Now, I'm not going to go into I'm not going to go into my whole comic book life story, but the abridged version is that, like a lot of kids, I started reading superhero comics, Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, X-Men, etc., which I often got from the drugstore or one of these small comic shops in my area. Then quite early on in my teens, may have been as early as 13 or 14, I began to discover some more mature offerings. I remember around that time, a family friend gifted me 3 trade paperbacks, graphic novels: Alan Moore's Watchmen, Alan Moore's V for Vendetta, and Chester Brown's Ed the Happy Clown, which collected some of his Yummy Fur comics. This opened up a whole new world for me. From then on, I delved deeper into the world of independent and underground comics. The Kramer's Ergot anthologies remain a favorite from that period. I would still read superhero books from time to time, though I had pretty much made a total shift from floppies to trade paperbacks, which is still my preferred format for reading. Also, even though I hadn't been too invested in what Marvel or DC had been doing since the 90s, I kept myself informed to a degree into what they were up to as I read Wizard magazine every month, and continued to do so until probably around issue 200. Though by that time the magazine was long past its prime. I'll kind of skip over my 20s and 30s, where I was still reading comics, but perhaps focused more on reading books that didn't have any pictures. Fiction, nonfiction, religion, philosophy, poetry. Just a young man trying to make sense of the world and always discovering all manner of music, art, and artist. I had replaced my trusty Wizard magazine with Juxtapose, where I discovered many artists who provided a new kind of inspiration. Some of whom I'm glad to have rediscovered, if you will, in recent years. Artists such as Skinner, Chet Zar, and friend of kayfabe and notorious maniac David Cho. Fast forward to around January 2020, I had pulled out my small collection of long boxes that had been sitting at the back of a closet for many years, as my comic reading throughout my 20s and 30s was, as I said, almost exclusively through graphic novels and trade paperbacks. Going through them was the catalyst for my return to collecting single issues. Before I knew it, I was hooked again. Not just into collecting, but I felt a renewed passion for the medium that I had not had in many years. Depending on how you look at it, this either was or was not great timing, as shortly thereafter COVID hit and the pandemic lockdown was in full effect. Though this presented what turned out to be an opportunity to meet lots of great people online, as I started buying books regularly from live sales on Instagram and YouTube, becoming acquainted with other regulars in the chat. Now, this was during the lockdown, but once the weather warmed up, that did not stop people from having yard sales, the first of which I went to that year did have some comic books, but I only walked away with one, Volume 1 of Hip Hop Family Tree. Shortly after that, I bought my first collection, which introduced me to what would become two of my favorite series ever, Gideon Falls and Ice Cream Man, but the collection also included several copies of X-Men Grand Design. The following year, I bought every single issue of Red Room and its sequels when they came out, multiples of many, as there were so many great variant covers. And I mention this to say that at a time when my love for comic books in general was reignited, is also when I discovered and became a fan of Ed Piskor's comic books. He is one of the creators that I had not previously been familiar with that really stood out to me. And in addition to his comics, it was in 2020 that I discovered cartoonist kayfabe. And so, like a lot of fans of Ed's work and with the channel, I became very familiar with Ed as a unique voice that relentlessly championed the medium of comics. And so for the better part of the past 4 years, I've been listening to Ed's voice along with Jim Ruggs on a weekly basis. In 2020, I started my own YouTube channel, and kayfabe was absolutely an inspiration in that. And as a result of creating content, my diet of consuming content on YouTube increased substantially. And I'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who I've listened to speaking over these past 3 to 4 years than Ed Piskor and Jim Rugg. Now, if you are familiar with cartoonist kayfabe, I need not go into what makes it such a great channel. You already know. And for those not familiar, all I can say is go check it out. There's like 1,500 videos there for you to watch. Now, cartoonist kayfabe for me was always entertaining, but first and foremost, it was an education. Ed had this wealth of knowledge of both Western comics and manga, and I learned a great deal about the history of comics through kayfabe, not just the art and the writing, but all aspects of the industry. Then, of course, there's all the excellent shoot interviews, Rob Liefeld, Dennis Kitchen, Todd McFarlane, Seth, David Cho, Eastman and Laird, many more. Those are some of my favorite discussions I've heard with artists and writers to date. Highly recommend them. And discovering cartoonist kayfabe, not only Ed and Jim, but fellow King kayfabers and others in the chat, it was definitely like finding kindred spirits. People who are just as passionate about your mainstream big two superheroes and superstar creators as they are about independent, underground, and self-published comics made by the deranged freaks and non-conformists that live on the fringes of society. I was born and raised in Toronto, Canada, which also happens to be home to The Beguiling, my favorite comic book shop in the city. And if you're hip to the alternative comic scene or regular viewers of kayfabe, you may have heard of it. I know Ed and Jim mentioned it on more than one occasion, as it is perhaps one of the foremost shops in North America when it comes to supporting independent creators and providing real-life physical shelf space for underground, small press, and self-published comics. In addition to that, they carry all the popular stuff as well. All the Marvel, DC, Image stuff. It's like two comic shops in one almost. And this shop was opened in 1987, and my first visit there was sometime in the early 90s after the shop had made its move to Mirvish Village. I was probably about 14 or 15 years old at the time, and this was around the time I'd really begun to expand my horizons beyond superheroes into the world of freaky, independent, and underground comics. Now, I mentioned The Beguiling not only because it has played an important role in my life as an artist and as a reader of comics, but also because when I discovered cartoonist kayfabe, it was like walking into that shop for the first time all over again. Here were these guys who would go from breaking down an issue of Wizard, a publication which I used to read religiously, to talking about the color palettes of a Mike Mignola Batman story, to Robert Crumb's horniest drawings, to looking at a Kevin Nolan artist edition, to doujinshi, outlaw manga, and bootleg Superman comics. I like all of those things. I like all of those things very much, even if I didn't know I did because I hadn't discovered it until Ed and Jim brought it to my attention. As they did to many others. The kayfabe effect was very real. As for the future of the channel, I'm sure it's still too soon for Jim to say exactly what will happen. I know that there is a backlog of a certain number of videos, and Jim has been uploading a few here and there over the past 2 weeks or so. But thankfully for the time, it's still here, and I still have hours of content to catch up on some. I've got my own personal backlog of kayfabe videos that I never saw that I still need to watch and look very much forward to doing so. So as a fellow comic book YouTuber, as a collector and a reader, cartoonist kayfabe has been amazing and influential. It's especially influenced my to-read list, that's for sure. It's also been super important for me as an artist. Ed and Jim, both being comic creators themselves, they would do deep dives on certain books and artists, dissecting the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I could easily make this whole video about some of my favorite kayfabe moments in regards to them examining the unique components and stylistic choices that make up the art and storytelling of a particular comic book or of an artist. And as an artist myself, in the process of making my own comic, those breakdowns have been invaluable in that it's one thing to sit and read, and examine a comic on one's own, but it's another to have the input of others who may point out things, that I may have missed, elements that may either improve or take away from composition or storytelling, what have you. And yes, it's subjective, but Ed and Jim's critiques have given me a greater understanding and appreciation of the medium as a whole. Now, in the interest of preventing this from being a 2-hour video, I'm not going to go really into my history as an artist. Growing up as a kid whose life goal was to be the next Todd McFarlane or Jim Lee, or about how I was self-publishing my comics and zines I made with my family and friends while I was still in elementary school. Long story short, my life took a different direction, so that hasn't happened yet. I'm not Todd McFarlane, that's for sure, but not yet anyway. Never say never. But I will save that for another video or videos. That being said, I remain a fan of Ed's work as an artist, and when I spent a month making my own Red Room homage piece, I spent a lot of time with his art in those books. And man, I definitely could not have picked a gorier book to do that with. Ed was a sicko. Ed talked about his influences all the time, and you can no doubt find them in his work. But he absolutely had a style all his own. And so as an artist myself, kayfabe has been an excellent source of inspiration, turning me on to many artists I didn't know about and giving me further insights into the ones I already did. I'm gonna wrap this up by saying that Ed's passing hit close to home because I can only speculate as to what his state of mind was, but what I gathered from his final statement was that due to the circumstances he found himself in, the mob judgment he had to endure, Despite the fact that he may have made mistakes, they were human mistakes, and but the aftermath of that was really completely unwarranted in terms of, as I said, the mob judgment he faced. I imagine he felt that he had his whole life taken from him, because comics were not his whole life. They're not the entirety of anyone's life, not even Ed's, but clearly, they were an enormous part of it. And, to feel like you're not going to be able to do that anymore, your one true passion in life, that's, devastating. Unfortunately, I think there would have been a way beyond that, another way, a less final way. But, sometimes you just can't see the forest for the trees, and I imagine the immediate total despair that comes with feeling like your whole life is gone, you've had the rug pulled out from under you. Again, I can only speculate really as to what he was going through, but I imagine it was not great. And I'm not going to go into the if you haven't read his letter, he basically mentions that he was murdered essentially by certain people who were attacking him, and again, that could be for a whole other video. I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole right now. But the world that we live in now, that has created an environment where situations like this can happen, is clearly not good. And unfortunately, I don't know that that's really going to change anytime soon. One last thing, I'd seen a photo on Instagram of Ed's studio. I believe it was his old studio from at his parents' house when he was growing up, and he had a bunch of things written. It looked like it might have been written, I don't know, on the wall or on his drawing table. But he had written a quote from Daniel Clowes, someone who Ed was very vocal about his admiration for, and it read, "Being the most famous cartoonist is like being the most famous badminton player." And that sounds accurate. This is a niche thing, a small community. As far as comic book channels go, Cartoonist Kayfabe was one of the bigger ones, having over 90,000 subscribers. And yeah, that's a lot, but it's all relative, as 90,000 is a drop in the bucket compared to the millions of subscribers many gaming or health and lifestyle or just straight up vlog channels have. And like I say, it's easy to forget that even though Hollywood went all in on comic book movies, the medium is on which they're based is still a small world. But it's a world I'm proud and honored to be a part of, warts and all. And when I say that comic books, changed my life, it really did when I discovered how many people are just so willing to share their passion with each other, the kindness and support that's given without the expectation of anything in return. Just good-hearted people. Like every community, not everyone's a good-hearted person, but I found that in my experience, the majority of you are, absolutely. So I'm not really sure what all this has been, this video, but even if it was just an excuse to write some thoughts and memories down, put it up here on YouTube, that's okay. That's all it really has to be. And does any of my experience dovetail with the life and times of Ed Piskor? I don't know, other than to say that comic books have been such a huge part of my life and changed my life, and he was part of that. And Cartoonist Kayfabe as well, of course, is huge. It opened my eyes to a lot of things I may not otherwise have been aware of. And one last thing I'd say about Eddie P was that dude always made me laugh. Really liked his sense of humor, and he was never mean-spirited, and that's important to me. That kind of thing always sticks with me. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. And, don't forget those marching orders. Read more comics.